Back in ancient Greek politics, back in the around the first century, but in the times of the ancient Greeks, the king had personal representatives, and he sent them out, and they functioned under his authority. So picture the king of Greece. He had representatives that he would call in and send out, and they went out under his authority. They acted as his emissaries. They acted as his ambassadors. They acted as his messengers. And to make light of them was to be in danger of insubordination. Make sense? Now, guess what the word for these, well, let me say four things first. There were four things that were true about these envoys. Number one, they belonged to the one who sent them. They were servants of the king. Number two, they possessed all his authority and power. They spoke for the king. They acted for the king. Number three, they were commissioned to be sent and existed for the purposes for which they were sent, and those purposes only. They didn't get to say what their purpose was and what their commissioning was. The king determined their commission. Their job was to enact their commission. It was up to the king. And they were sent forth with the message of the sender. The words that came from their mouths had better be the words of the king. Make sense? Emissaries, the king of Greece would send out. The Greek name for this office was apostolos. Right? What does that sound like? It sounds like our word what? Apostle. It translates into our word apostle, which literally simply means one who is sent away. But the details of that sending we've just talked about. But literally it's just one who is sent away. Now when that word was transliterated into Latin from apostolos, guess what the word was? Missio, which sounds like our word missionary. That's where we get our word missionary from. If you have your Bibles, we're going to read in Matthew 10, verses 1 through 16. Please follow along with me. Summoning his 12 disciples, he gave them authority over unclean spirits and to drive them out and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the apostles. First Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew his brother. James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus. Simon the zealot and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Jesus sent these 12 after giving them instructions. Jesus sent them out. Don't take the road leading to other nations, and don't enter into Samaritan town. Instead, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, announce this: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those with skin diseases, drive out demons. You have received free of charge, give free of charge. Do not take any gold or silver or copper for your money belts. Don't take a traveling bag for the road, or an extra shirt, sandals, or a walking stick for the worker is worthy of his food. When you enter any town or village, find out who is worthy and stay there until you leave. Greet a household when you enter it, and if the household is worthy, let your peace be on it. But if the household is unworthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that house or town. I assure you, it will be better, more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Notice with me that this word apostle that we just gave the definitions for and all the linguistic history of is the word that Matthew used to describe these disciples of Jesus that were being sent out. And there are several details of this sending of these disciples, these brand new apostles. The first thing I want you to write down and notice is that these disciples were called. Jesus called them. It was his choice to call them. Jesus had chosen these 12 men, which we just named. They belonged to him. Remember our details? Jesus summoned these 12 men. They belonged to him. If you were to ask any of these 12 men, they would tell you they were slaves of the King, Jesus Christ. The second thing to notice is these disciples were confirmed. They were confirmed. In 1b it says how he said, "Come to me," and he gave them his power. They possessed the power of God. He gave them his authority. They possessed the authority of God. I don't have time to go deeply into that, but the same power that spoke the universe into existence, the same power that conquered the grave was in them. And they went to the world carrying it with them. They possessed the power of Jesus. Number 3, the disciples were commissioned. In verse 5a, it says that he sent the 12 of them out. These disciples, remember disciples? We've studied this a lot. What's a disciple? A disciple is a learner or a follower, right? A learner or a follower. These disciples became apostles. These learners and followers became ones who were sent out, right? They're growing up. They're maturing in Jesus. Let me say this too in this commissioning of them. Their mission defined their existence. Think about that for a second. The mission that Jesus gave them defined the reason that they existed. That's the only reason they're apostles. Because they were going on the mission of Jesus. Now, these disciples were also charged, and from 5b on through verse 14, it tells us what they're instructed to do. The disciples are charged by Jesus with these instructions. The first thing you'll notice is in Mark 6, which is the parallel telling of this verse. On your sheet, I wrote down there, the P-P means parallel passages that tell the same story. We're focusing on Matthew, but the other two synoptic gospels tell this story too. In Mark 6:7, he tells us that they went in pairs. How many of you knew this? The disciples were sent out in pairs. They didn't go alone. Why were they sent in pairs? Well, number one, the law required 2 witnesses to establish truth. So Jesus is smart, and he's keeping within the law. He wants 2 of them to go together because their 2 together constitutes truth before the law. Secondly, it was supplemental. One person won't reach everybody. Where one may not be heard of from the audience, the second might. They supplemented one another. Where one was weak, perhaps the other was strong. Different men reach different minds. Different women reach different minds. There are people in this world that you will reach sooner than I or even Billy Graham will reach, because God has shaped you to speak to their heart in your life experience. Much like one that Sharon has shared with us today will resonate with them because they'll identify with you and the Jesus in you. And the other thing that's obvious, what's the beauty of being with a faithful believer? Can't you encourage one another? You ever get discouraged? I do. And the beauty of walking along with another Christian is that they can encourage you. They went out in pairs. The second thing I want you to notice in verse 5 and 6 of our text is the path was set before them. The path was set before them. They didn't choose it. And let me say this too. They had already been to the places where they're about to go 2 times. Jesus has toured this area twice with these disciples. You know what we can learn from that, folks? It may take some time, and it may take a few trips to get the point of Christ across. Not everybody falls on the floor and believes Jesus the first time they hear of him. In fact, it takes 7 experiences with the gospel for the average person to believe it. Every once in a while, we just happen to be that 7th experience for them, and we get to see them saved. It may take some time, and it may take some trips. We got to be willing to keep working at it and not give up. And they were to go to people like them. Remember when we taught missions, we said there's a 3-fold training plan that Jesus took his disciples through to prepare them to be apostles. The first phase was they brought people to him. You may be in your faith situation right now to where you just met Jesus, and you don't really know enough about him to share him with somebody else. All you can say is you believe him and you've accepted him. You can say what it felt like for you to meet Jesus, but you don't really have the arrows in your quiver yet to lead someone else to Christ. Let me just say this. Invite them to church. I will help you. Our elders will help you. Our deacons will help you. Our wives will help you. The first phase of missions is just being courageous enough to invite someone to church with you. But the second phase is when you begin to mature a little bit, and that's when God will say, okay, you know what? Go to your Jerusalem and your Judea. Go to people like you. People who speak your language, you understand one another. They have the same culture. Go to them and share your story with them. And that's where we are in the phases of the lives of these disciples. They're at step 2, Charlie, of mission training. They're in motion on mission to the masses, just like this church is. And they're learning how to do it step by step by step. Isn't it great how Jesus grows us into what he expects of us? He just doesn't throw us to the wolves and expect us to figure it out on our own. They're to go to them, people like them. And I'm going to hearken back to last week's sermon, which I encourage you to go out and watch, by the way. Please go back out and watch last week's sermon if you weren't here to see it. I really think everybody in our church needs to hear it. Spread the word. Get people to log on to the Facebook church page as you have time and take the 30 or 35 minutes it takes to listen to last week's sermon. But they went to people like them, and Jesus called them what? Go to the lost sheep of Israel. Now, you didn't get to be here last week, but I'm going to do my best to fill you in quickly. From last week's sermon, we'll remember in Mark 6:6 that Jesus is on a mission. Jesus is on a mission. No place is too big. No place is too small. He's going to every town and village and speaking to every dirty, rotten, filthy, stinking sinner he can to say, look, I don't care what you've done. I love you. The kingdom is at hand. Believe me, and I'll save you from your sin. I'll give you a second chance at life. You can be born again. That's Jesus' mission. He went everywhere. He went to where the people were. When he was trying to reach Jews, he went to their synagogue because he knew, number one, they would all be there. And number two, they would be in a spiritual state of mind. They'd be thinking about God. So he went there. While they're thinking about God, he went there and told them the truth about God. And he preached the kingdom. Heaven has come to earth, and heaven will reside in us, and it'll give us the power to spread heaven to the ends of the earth because Jesus has come. And as he went along preaching this gospel, he healed folks to prove the gospel that he was proclaiming, the great work he was performing. Mark 6:6 told us that. And then last week, man, it was an epiphany for me. Told us what Jesus saw while he was on that mission. There were crowds of people drawn to him. You know what? Jesus draws people. You preach the gospel and people will come and hear it. Unless you're just so ugly to them, they don't ever know you're teaching it in the first place. The gospel will draw people if we'll get gracious enough to invite them to hear it. That's a witness for you. The crowds of people came to Jesus, and Jesus was moved with compassion for them. They got to the very core of his existence and moved him there. When he saw them, he felt for them. And you know what he saw in these crowds of people? The same thing I see here every week amongst our crowd of people, and same thing I am some weeks. Number one, they were weary. These people were weary. They were ready to collapse from the trials of their life. They could take no more. You couldn't put any more sugar in the Kool-Aid. They'd taken all that they could take. They couldn't stand it anymore. Is that any of us? Have you ever come to the place in your life where you say, you know what, I'm so tired, I'm ready to collapse. I can't take anymore. Jesus, if you don't graciously reach down and provide for me, I'm not going to make it. Is that any of us ever? Man, they were weary. Second thing he noticed is that they were worn out. They were used up. They were thrown down. They were invisible. Nobody saw them, cared about them, felt for them, did anything for them. They were so tired they were ready to collapse, and the world around them used them up and threw them away. You ever felt used up and thrown away by the world you live in? Can I speak to the heart of the people? If you're really truly living for Jesus in the world that we live in, you're going to feel like that a lot. Because the world's doing everything it can to throw us aside. And the scary thing about it is we're letting it happen. They were worn out. Is that any of us? Then he goes on to say, they were like sheep without a shepherd. Remember that last week? They were like sheep with no shepherd. Their leaders, Israel's leaders, the guys that should have been leading them, their shepherds, were leading them further and further and further away from the kingdom, not towards it, because all they cared about was legalism. They cared about what you do. Jesus doesn't care about what you're doing. He cares about what you believe. If you'll believe Jesus and your attitude towards him changes, he will take care of your actions. I am living proof of that. I tried to change my actions for years, decades. Nothing I tried to do ever worked, and there's very few things I've ever set my mind to that I didn't do, and that's one of the few. There's two things. That's one of the two. The other was overcoming depression. I'll talk to you about that on another day. The legalism piled in on these people. And the rules confined them until they just marched further and further and further away from the kingdom because they said, you know what, I can't do this. I can't do it. It's not possible to do it. They were sheep without a shepherd. You know what else the text last week taught us? They were like harvest without harvesters. Remember? The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. The harvesters are few. Jesus' kingdom work outweighed the workforce. There's a big harvest out there of people who need to hear the gospel and need to meet you and hear it from you. They need to come to church with you. And he says, you know what? There's not enough workers in the harvest. Here's what you got to do. Number one, you got to pray for the workers. Pray for more workers. And last week we encouraged you to pray for more workers within this body. May the people right now that are sitting on their hands and doing nothing, may they begin to commit to the gospel and remember just exactly what it took for them to meet Jesus in the first place and stop being lazy and counterfeit and fake and spoiled. And say, you know what? Jesus gave everything for me, and I haven't given him a smidgen of anything of my own life. We need more workers from within. The gospel needs more workers from within the kingdom of God, from the spoiled, lazy, rotten Christians who are doing nothing but converting oxygen to carbon dioxide and using up the gospel message in their lackadaisical attitude. We need more workers in the church. We also need more workers from without the church. You know what I began praying about a year and a half ago? I said, God, it may be that the solutions to this church's problems don't go here yet. Maybe the solution to the world's problems, the church's problems, the universal solution to the church's problems are people out there in the world who don't even know Jesus yet. But they need to meet him so they can believe him and they can be equipped to be sent by him. Maybe the solution to the church's problems are not within the church, they're without. One way or the other, we need to pray for workers because the harvest is way bigger than we are. So he says, pray. You know what prayer, you know what good prayer is without legs? Zip. Prayer that doesn't turn into action is worthless. Yes, I said it. Prayer that doesn't go anywhere and turn into some form of action does no good to anybody. So he says to them, look, you need to pray for more workers in the harvest. From within and without. From within. The disciples were to go to see the workforce. They were going to feel and to do what Jesus did. It's time we went, saw, felt, and did what Jesus did. It's time we started doing that. Every Christian should reach the point in life of transitioning from a disciple, a follower, a learner, a taker, to the point to where they're apostles, under shepherds, harvesters, facilitators, ones who were sent out. There comes a point in every Christian's life where it's time to stop consuming and become a provider. Search without. Disciples were to go and enlist others to go. This is inclusive. Everyone's welcome. Everyone. No matter where they're from or what they've done, they're welcome to accept this gospel, come on board with us, and move in the direction of the gospel with us. There are no folks who are not welcome to come, as long as they're willing to go where we go, see what we see, feel what we feel, and do what we do, because what we're trying to do is what Jesus did. It's time we start doing that as well. The second thing every Christian should do is they should reach a point in their life where they have a legacy of workers, under shepherds, harvesters, following them. If you look behind yourself, is there a legacy of people following you who are following Jesus because they met you? If not, what are you doing? If there isn't a legacy of people following you to the gospel and to make others followers of the gospel, it might be time to do a little something. Look behind you. If no one's following you, you're not a leader. And if you're not a leader, people are going to die and go to hell all around you because they'll fail to meet the gospel from you, and you're accountable for that gospel to the people in your life. Jesus sent them in pairs. He gave them the path, and he told them to preach. Tell your story. As you go, we're all going through life. There's no stopping it. We got to go to work. We got to go to school. We got to go to the grocery store. As we go through life, preach. Now, what does that mean literally? Not this necessarily what I'm doing, what Sharon just did. Sit around over a cup of coffee over the people that you meet and tell them what Jesus has done for you. And it's amazing what he'll do for them. We're Christ's messengers. Remember the obligatory requirements for the apostle? One of those is that they take the message of their king. We have the message of the king. We are to proclaim the kingdom, nothing else. Jesus loves you. He wants to save you. He died for you. He went into the grave for you. He rose again for you. You cannot be too bad for Jesus to save you. That's the gospel. Preach it, teach it, tell it. The most powerful thing in this universe is your story if you're willing to tell it to others. Because God will draw people like you. It's amazing what he will do because he will draw people like you that need to hear just from you. If you don't believe me, go on a mission trip somewhere and watch what God does. He also says you're to provide for these people. He says, here's how you provide. Verse 8, heal the sick. Raise the dead. You say, wait a minute, I can't raise the dead. Oh, yes, you can. Everyone without Jesus is walking around dead as 4 o'clock. They're spiritually dead, and if they die in that state, they're going to be dead again twice, and they're going to experience hell with their future. I don't often talk about this like this, but that's the God's honest truth. The only way to meet God and experience heaven with him is to meet Jesus, and there's a whole lot of people around us who need to meet Jesus. And if you'll tell them your story and they believe him, then you have raised the dead. Because they've been born again. And being born again means life, right? Cleanse lepers. You might have to touch people that are nasty. That's a tough one. In this world of antibacterial soap and hand sanitizer, it's almost funny. Every time we go somewhere, somebody's trying to squirt that stuff on you, right? You need to wash your hands. You might have to touch somebody and then go wash your hands. Trust God. Because Jesus said, cleanse lepers, touch the nasty, drive out demons. You believe in demons? Let me take you around a couple of times. I'll show you what demons look like. Where you live determines what they look like, but I have seen them, and I have seen God expel them from the lives of others. I have seen it. I'm telling you what I've seen. How many of you have ever seen Jesus cleanse a demon from a person? Absolutely. You may have been that person. And then he says this, freely you've received, freely give. Now what's he talking about? As we go through the world and we reach these folks for Jesus and we minister to these folks for Jesus and we go and love these folks for Jesus, do you know what it should cost them? Nothing. It shouldn't cost the people that we're ministering to anything to experience Jesus other than the willingness to accept him. And you say, well, then where is the reciprocity of this? Give me a second, I'll get to that. But on the front end, when we're going out and trying to reach sinners with the gospel, that shouldn't cost them anything but willingness to listen and the courage to accept it. That's all it should cost. Jesus paid it all on that gig. They were to provide freely because they'd received freely. What did it cost these disciples to have Jesus in their hearts and lives? It didn't cost them anything. But it cost them everything to follow him, didn't it? They were to preach. They were to provide. And then let's talk about the provisions, because I know where you're going right now. You're like, wait a minute. If this thing's totally free to the world, how do you fund it? I'm with you. I look at the numbers every week. I see the balance sheet. We're not going to camp out here because we're about to vote in a new budget in about a month, and we're going to go through our stewardship campaign like we do every year. We're going to talk about what it takes for this church to grow this year. But let me say this. The provisions that God speaks of in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 10 are this. The believers of the world are supposed to provide all the resources that it takes to go out and reach the world for Jesus. Who pays for the reaching of the lost? Believers pay for it. Write this down, 1 Corinthians 16:2. Don't just believe me because I said it. Go look at 1 Corinthians 16:2 later and check and see if I'm telling you the truth. What is the provision for the resources it takes to go to the world and make sure that they can receive the gospel free of charge? We have to be willing to give. And secondly, why is that giving necessary? 1 Corinthians 9:14 teaches this. People have to give so that the apostles can focus on the gospel. The disciples could focus on the gospel. Don't take a traveling bag or an extra stick or sandals or walking stick, for the worker is what? Worthy of his food. If you're out preaching the gospel and you're doing the works of the gospel, that should be provided for. That's a living in and of itself. The provisions were to be provided by the faithful. And then what's the obvious? Well, that pool of faithful grows, and you have more resources to go out and reach more like you, right? It's not rocket science. That's where the provisions were to come from. Let's talk about the perception of these disciples, because this is where it gets a little bit tricky. He says, when you enter a town, the first thing you do, when you enter it, the very first thing you do is look, seek, investigate, keep your eyes open, be perceptive, be aware, look for worthy households to stay in. You can't just stay anywhere. You may have to go anywhere to preach the gospel, but you got to be careful where you hang your hat and where you stay. How do they know? How do they know what houses to stay in and which ones to leave? They had to be on with the Spirit because they had to be discerning, because when they walked in, they were supposed to greet the household as they entered, and the Spirit would discern within them whether or not it was a worthy household for them to be in. Are these people fake or are they real? Are they putting on a Jesus show or are they really Jesus? You can tell. You may not think so. People know you're faking it. Hallelujah. You only think you're getting by. And if they are worthy, if they are who they say they are, what does worthy mean? They're living for Jesus. They're not putting on an act. They are exactly who they seem to be. They don't come across as perfect. They come across as forgiven. And if those folks are like that, then you know what? Put your peace upon them, because they need it. It ain't easy living for Jesus. Pray peace for one another. It's a tough gig we're doing. Pour your peace out on these people. And guess what? If they're not worthy, guess what your peace will do? It will return to you. If your peace returns to you, it'll break your heart. Let me tell you. But here's what Jesus says to do based on that. He says, you know what? Persist. Persist. Mark 6:10 and Luke 9:4 echo what I'm about to say to you now. But you know what Jesus told his disciples to do? When you find a house that's worthy, stay there. Don't bounce around. Stay there. Now, can I just say to you quickly that the reason why we structure under my leadership, the reason we structure international missions the way we do, and we don't travel all over the world, we keep going back to the same place, that. What happens when you stay with the same people for an extended period of time? What happens? You got focused discipleship, because you get past all the hello, how are you, and you decide whether you're going to, give each other sugar or not, figuratively speaking. And once you get past that, then you have that discipleship and fellowship opportunity that only comes with intimacy. I'm not telling you that's right for everybody. That's how we're going to do it. Because if you're not careful, every time you go somewhere new and you're trying to set up for the gospel, you spend the first 2 or 3 days getting to know one another. Jesus said, you know what? Cut out the middle, man. Get rid of the extraneous. When you find a worthy house, stay there until you move on. And you know what God does? God blesses that household. And you say, well, that's awfully central. Yeah, but guess what God does by blessing that household? He blesses those around them. When the rain falls on the just, it also falls on the unjust. The beauty of Christian blessings is that when Christians are blessed, the people around them who don't know Jesus receive an overflow of blessings themselves. That's what makes the gospel real to people. Persist, focus discipleship and fellowship. And lastly, he says, you know what? You have the power to preclude. This is scary. We never really think about the power we have as Christians, but he says you have the power to preclude. I'm going to read verse 14 again. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that house or town. Whew. We like to say that out loud because it gives us an excuse. That's scary stuff. If you really think about what it means, it's scary. If anyone doesn't welcome and listen, leave them. What? Sow the seeds of the gospel, live a gospel example, and move on to the next one. How's that going to work? Could we trust the Holy Spirit for that part of it? 7 experiences. Not all 7 of those are necessarily going to come from you. Shake off the dust from your feet. What does that mean? How many of you ever said that before? Hey, man, shake the dust off your feet. Because you've heard it in the Bible. We say it all the time, don't we? All right, what does it mean? Why do you shake the dust off your feet? What is that doing? It is removing every remnant, every little small particle of evidence of that place. Now, from the Christian standpoint, we say that like, oh, yeah, I'll just shake the dust off my feet. When you do, that's a testimony against those people. They are forgotten. They're behind. You've moved on. Is it important that we do that and focus on the people that want to be reached? Yes, but you know what else makes this so important? We better tell the gospel the right way the first time. We better be loving and right the first time, because you can't walk out there and say, well, I'll shake the dust off my feet. If you haven't loved these people right and you haven't spoken the truth to them and you haven't done life with them, guess what? You're going to be accountable for that one. Purge that house and town from your testimony. Whew. Folks, listen. Today you're going to decide what you're going to do with the gospel. Everyone does. Everyone chooses what they're going to do with the gospel. I'm not responsible for the rejection of the gospel of the people that listen to me. I feel responsible. That's why I try so hard to try to say succinctly, and I try to make sure that things are understandable, and I try to keep the cookies on the bottom shelf, if you will. I trust that mature Christians won't get bored, and they'll understand that what I'm really trying to do is communicate the gospel to people that have never heard it before. I do my best to try to communicate it in a way to where you can get it, but if you don't get it, that's on you. I've done my thing. When you preach the gospel and teach the gospel to people and you do it with the best of your power and the Spirit's involved with it, look, that's on them. Walk away and trust God. Is that easy? No, because hopefully you have a relationship with these people. We're talking about people that you developed a relationship with. If you don't really know them, you probably shouldn't be preaching the gospel to them anyway. You should be showing them what Jesus looks like and ask God to give you that opportunity to preach the gospel. But we're not responsible for the rejections of others. It's their responsibility, however, to share the gospel. Are you sharing the gospel? There ain't no way to talk that one down. You can't talk that one down. Because the scary thing in verse 15 we find is that the disbelieving were cursed. Y'all, you know what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Anybody know what the Dead Sea is? Anybody ever heard about the Dead Sea? There's so much salt in it that nothing can live in it. Do you know what most experts and archaeologists believe, and I agree with them? You know what's buried at the bottom of that Dead Sea? What made it so deep, made it so dead? That's where Sodom and Gomorrah are. They're beneath all that, all those feet and leagues of death for the judgment that was bestowed upon them. And you know what he's saying? When we go to a place and we preach the gospel and they refuse to accept it, it's worse for them than for Sodom and Gomorrah. Wow. Does that sound like something you should take lightly? Something might be a better time to get serious a little bit, ain't it? Something other. These apostles would be the men that fostered the church. We are here today because of the work that these 12 men did. Or 11 of the 12. So what are the qualifications of an apostle? Let's say that you would like to be an apostle. I'm going to ask. Here's what is required to be an apostle of Jesus. Number one, you have to have seen him. You have to have met him. You have to have an intimate relationship with him because you can't talk about what you don't know. You can't talk about people you don't know. We do it, but I hope people don't listen to us when we do it. You have to know somebody to share them. Do you know Jesus? If you don't know Jesus, you can't be an apostle. You're the one the apostles are trying to reach. Is that you? Do you know Jesus today? Because that's one requirement of apostleship. And this church desperately needs workers to stand up and go to work and be apostles to our community. The number one thing, you have to know Jesus. For God so loved the world. For God loved you so much that he gave his son. I have a son. And I love him. Makes me crazy sometimes. But I love him. I wouldn't give my son for you. I love you. But if it came down to you or my kid, I'd give myself for you. I ain't giving my kid for you. That's my child. My life's blood's in that kid. But God said, you know what? I'll give my son for them. So they can know me by knowing him. You know Jesus. Do you realize that he gave his life just for you? If you were the only lost person in the world, Jesus would have condescended. He would have come down from earth, heaven to earth, and he would have allowed himself to be nailed on that cross perfect because your sin meant that much to him. Even though you may hate him, you may curse him, you may not believe about him, every time he's in your mouth and he comes out of your mouth, you may be talking dastardly and deadly and ugly and awful things about Jesus. It don't matter. He still died for you. How would you like to know that you had to give your son for people that would curse him and not care about him? That's what God did. Do you have Jesus in your heart? If you don't, that's on you. But as of today, it's a great time to meet him because he loves you. There's nothing you can do that's too bad. There's no distance you can go that's too far. Jesus wants to save you today. Just like he saved me from a terrible life. If you want to be an apostle, first thing you got to do is know Jesus. Do you know Jesus? In a moment, we'll give you a chance to respond. If you want to be a disciple and that transitions into apostle, can I tell you this too? Jesus has to call you. You got a call on your life? You do, whether you know it or not. But it's a call from Jesus that determines the marching orders that you get from him. Not everybody's ministry is going to look the same. In fact, everyone's ministry is going to be different. But he's going to call you to it. Once you know Jesus, he'll call you and he'll use you to change your world. Wouldn't you love to get to heaven and know that there's a whole lot of people that didn't go to hell because you love Jesus enough to tell him about him? That would be nice, wouldn't it? Your teaching has to be divinely inspired. I pray with every passion in me that every time I open my mouth, it will be God speaking, not me speaking. And when you have buried the word of God in your heart and you've talked to him and you've prayed with him and you've studied on him and you've meditated on him, when you open your mouth to speak to others, it's the very words of God that come from you. Are you speaking the words of God today? If not, it might be because you're not pouring them into yourself. Maybe you need to be in a small group and be disciple. And then he gives us the power to perform miracles. Did you know that Jesus said before he left the earth, you know what, I've done some amazing works. I've raised the dead. I've healed lepers. I've turned water to wine. I have done amazing things. Remember Jesus? Jesus did some cool stuff, did some powerful stuff. You know what he said when he left? He said, you will do greater things than I did. You know who he's talking to? You, me. What are the greater things that we can do in Jesus' wake? What's our legacy to him? When he walks along, he's leading a whole pile of apostles behind him who are working better works than he worked. And what is that work? Salvation. We got God in us and we speak the truth to men. Have you contemplated the enormity of our mission as a church? Have you ever thought about how big a deal it is what we do? Or do you just come give your hour and a half every week, go to the house, eat your casserole, and move on to the next thing? I get it. I've been there. But you know what this church needs? You know what the elders and I are praying for? We're praying for people to take this thing home with them. I'm serious about that. Please take it home with you. You're going to be graded. You may not think so, but you're going to get a report card for this thing. We have the opportunity to bring peace to those who listen to us. If you're able to say you've ever been weary or you're worn out, and what you really need in your life is peace. You need to have peace from your trials and your tribulations and your heartache and your sorrow, from the people that have broken your heart, from the things in your life you can't control. You need peace because you are worn down to the place where you can't stand, and it's like the world's wadded you up and thrown you away. Jesus wants to provide peace to you, and he wants to use us to do it.